Here we will see data binding in ADO.NET. First we will see what is data binding. It is a process that establishes a connection between the application user interface and the data that it displays. With data binding, if an outer representation of the data in an element changes, then the underlying data can be automatically updated to reflect the change. For example, if the user edits the value in the text box element, the data value is automatically updated to reflect that change. A typical use of data binding is to place server or local configuration data into forms or other UI controls. In WPF, this concept is expanded to include binding a broad range of properties to different kinds of data sources. And dependency properties of elements can be bound to .NET objects, which includes ADO.NET object or objects associated with the web services and web properties, and also XML data. In data binding, the data flow of binding can go from the binding target to the binding sources, or from the binding source to the binding target if the binding source provides the proper notification. That is, the source value is changed when a user edits the value of a text box, and that text box content is updated with the change in the binding source. For example, if we bound the content of text box to the employee.name property, for this, set the target as text box, target property as text, source object will be employee, and source object value path will be name. Since the data binding is act as a bridge between your binding target and binding source, basic concepts of data binding are data source, which refers to the object or collection that provides the data to be displayed and manipulated. It can be a simple property, a custom object, a collection, or even a database. Then target property. This is the property of the UI control that will display or interact with the data. For example, text property for text box, item source property for a list box, and binding mode, which specifies how data flows between the source and target. Common modes are one way, where data flows from source to target; two way, where data flows in both directions, which allows the changes in UI to update the source and vice versa. With one way to source, data flows from target to the source, and with one time, data flows from the source target only when the binding is initialized. First we'll see one-way binding. One-way binding causes changes to the source property to automatically update the target property, but changes to the target property are not propagated back to the source property. This type of binding is appropriate if the control is being bound for implicitly read only. For example, if there is no need to monitor the changes of the target property, you can use one-way binding mode to avoid the overhead of two-way binding mode. Then we'll say two-way binding. Two-way binding causes changes to either the source property or the target property to automatically update the other. With this, you can establish a connection with the elements such that any changes made to the data source are reflected immediately in the visual elements and vice versa. This type of binding is appropriate for editable forms or other fully interactive UI scenarios. Most properties are default set to one-way binding, but some dependencies properties, typically the properties of user editable controls such as text box or checkbox, are set default two-way binding. Then one way to source. This type of data binding is a one-way binding that flows data from the target property to the source property, which updates the source when target changes. This is often used for read-only target properties such as selected item property of list view, where the goal is to set the source property with the selected item. Unlike one-way binding, data only flows in a single direction, that is target to source, and not the other way around it. Different uses of data binding in ADO.NET are: it displays the data from a database in UI control. With data binding, you can easily populate UI elements like text boxes, list boxes, and data grids with data retrieved from a database without writing extensive code to manually populate each control. Then real-time data updates. When the data in the database changes, the bound UI elements are automatically updated to reflect the new values. User input handling. It allows users to directly edit data in UI controls, which are then automatically saved back to the database through data binding. Then data filtering and sorting. It utilizes features like data view in ADO.NET to filter and sort the data before displaying it in the UI, which provides user with customized views of the data and efficient UI development. Data binding significantly reduces the amount of code needed to manage the data display and updates in the UI. which makes development faster and more maintainable. Advantages of data binding are database applications can be created quickly and efficiently. Coding size decreases incredibly. Still, you get the desired result. Execution is faster and hence it increases the quality of the application. By using events, you can gain control over the data binding process. And even if your data is bounded, you can modify the coding part easily. And programmers get the benefit of both unbound and bound approach while creating any application. And disadvantages of data binding are more optimized code can be written by using the unbound or traditional methods. And data binding is not completely flexible. For achieving more flexibility, so traditional methods are used by many programmers. There are two ways to display the data from the database in window application at runtime. First, unbound mode. Here UI controls are not directly linked to the data source. Here data must be manually loaded into the controls and explicitly saved back to the data source through code. And bound mode. Here UI controls are directly linked to the data source such as data set, data table or a collection of objects.